Have you ever imagined facing a warrior nearly 10 feet tall, covered in armor from head to toe? And what if I told you there were not one, but two such giants in the Bible, so fearsome that entire armies trembled at their sight? Get ready for an epic journey through sacred pages, where we will discover how God used the unlikely to defeat the seemingly invincible. Our story begins in the wilderness, where the Israelites, freshly freed from slavery in Egypt, faced their first giant, Og, king of Bashan. But that is just the beginning. Our journey through the ancient stories begins in the desert, where the Israelites, newly liberated from centuries of enslavement in Egypt, encounter their first formidable foe, Og, the king of Bashan. Picture this. A people who had known only captivity now stood face to face with a king whose bed measured over 13 feet long, Deuteronomy 3:11. The Bible gives us intriguing details about Og, mentioning that he was the last of the Rephaim, a race of giants. His bed, a massive iron structure, was preserved among the Ammonites as a relic of his enormous stature and strength. Og was not only immense in size but also wielded great power. He ruled over 60 fortified cities, each protected by high walls, gates, and iron bars, Deuteronomy 3:5. Imagine the terror that must have gripped the Israelites as they faced such a daunting adversary, a people with little experience in battle, standing before a king whose might was renowned across the region. Yet here lies the first powerful lesson we can draw. The size of our challenge does not matter when God is on our side. God spoke to Moses in Numbers 21:34, saying, "Do not fear him, for I have delivered him into your hands, along with his whole army and his land." This promise must have sounded almost impossible to the Israelites. But God was about to prove that his word always holds true. Interestingly, this was not the first time God had given such assurance to his people. Before facing Og, the Israelites had already defeated Sihon, king of the Amorites, with a similar promise from God. This previous victory should have bolstered their faith, yet confronting a giant like Og remained a formidable test. The repetition of God's promise at this crucial moment reminds us that he is patient with our doubts and fears, always ready to reassure us of his presence. The ensuing battle was nothing short of spectacular. Despite Og's strength and the formidable defenses of his kingdom, the Israelites, led by Moses and empowered by God's promise, achieved a resounding victory. Deuteronomy 3:7 provides a vivid account of the aftermath. "So the Lord our God delivered into our hands Og king of Bashan and all his army. We struck them down, leaving no survivors. At that time we took all his cities, 60 cities, the entire region of Argob." This detailed description serves not only as a historical record but also as a testament to the complete victory that God granted his people. The specific mention of 60 fortified cities highlights the scale of the triumph, showing that no human defense, no matter how impressive, can withstand God's power when he moves on behalf of his people. This victory was not just a military success, but a living testimony of God's power and his faithfulness to his promises. Imagine the impact this had on the faith and courage of the Israelites, a people who had recently feared returning to Egypt in the face of hardship, now standing victorious over one of the region's most feared kings. The conquest of Bashan became a landmark in Israel's history, often remembered in the Psalms and other passages as an example of God's liberating power. For instance, Psalm 135:10-12 declares that God struck down many nations and killed mighty kings: Sihon, king of the Amorites, Og, king of Bashan, and all the kingdoms of Canaan. This memory served as a beacon of hope and confidence for future generations, reminding them that with God, no obstacle is insurmountable. The victory over Og not only removed an immediate threat, but also paved the way for the conquest of the Promised Land. Bashan was a fertile region strategically located east of the Jordan River. Its capture provided the Israelites with a solid base for their future campaigns west of the Jordan. Additionally, the defeat of such a powerful and feared king like Og sent shockwaves through Canaan, spreading fear among the other peoples that the Israelites would face. We see evidence of this in Joshua 2:10, where Rahab, a resident of Jericho, tells the Israelite spies, "We have heard how the Lord dried up the waters of the Red Sea for you when you came out of Egypt, and what you did to Sihon and Og, the two kings of the Amorites east of the Jordan, whom you completely destroyed." This passage reveals how the fame of Israel's victories, including the defeat of Og, spread far and wide, fulfilling God's promise to instill fear among the nations. Deuteronomy 2:25. But the story doesn't end here. Centuries later, the Israelites would face another giant, perhaps even more intimidating than Og. His name was Goliath, and he would emerge as the champion of the Philistines, the arch-enemies of Israel during the time of King Saul. The setting of this new battle could not have been more different. Instead of the deserts and fortified cities of Bashan, the stage was the valley of Elah, a fertile area in the hill country of Judah. The political and military context had also changed dramatically. No longer a nomadic people freshly escaped from Egypt, the Israelites were now an established nation with a king of their own. Yet despite these changes, they faced the same challenge: trusting God when confronted with a seemingly unbeatable foe. Goliath was a sight to behold. The Bible gives a detailed description of his appearance in 1 Samuel 17, 4-7. A champion named Goliath, who was from Gath, came out of the Philistine camp. His height was 6 cubits and a span, about 9 feet 6 inches. He wore a bronze helmet and a coat of scale armor weighing 5,000 shekels, over 125 pounds. His legs were protected by bronze greaves, and he carried a javelin slung over his back. The shaft of his spear was like a weaver's rod, and its iron point weighed 600 shekels, about 15 pounds. Before him marched his shield-bearer. Let's pause for a moment to consider these measurements. Goliath's height, nearly 10 feet, and the weight of his armor made him a walking fortress. For 40 days, he taunted the Israelite army, challenging them to send out a warrior to fight him. 1 Samuel 17, 8-10 records his scornful words. "Why do you come out and line up for battle? Am I not a Philistine? And are you not the servants of Saul? Choose a man and have him come down to me. If he is able to fight and kill me, we will become your subjects. But if I overcome him and kill him, you will become our subjects and serve us." Imagine the devastating impact this had on the morale of the Israelite troops. Every morning and evening, for more than a month, they were reminded of their apparent inferiority in the face of this colossal Philistine. Fear spread like a plague through the camp. The situation was so dire that 1 Samuel 17:11 tells us, "On hearing the Philistines' words, Saul and all the Israelites were dismayed and terrified. Yet, in this desperate scene, an unlikely hero stepped forward: David, a young shepherd." The introduction of David into the story is portrayed in a seemingly casual manner. He was not part of the battlefield, but was at home tending his father's sheep. It was only when his father sent him to deliver supplies to his brothers in the army that David encountered the situation. 1 Samuel 17:20-22 describes the scene. Early in the morning, David left the flock in the care of a shepherd, loaded up and set out as Jesse had directed. He reached the camp as the army was going out to its battle positions, shouting the war cry. Israel and the Philistines were drawing up their lines, facing each other. This scene emphasizes the stark contrast between David and the experienced soldiers. While they prepared for battle with shouts of war, David arrived as a simple messenger, unaware of the fear that gripped the camp. Yet, where seasoned warriors quivered with fear, this young man, driven by unshakable faith, volunteered to face Goliath. David's initial reaction to Goliath's challenge is recorded in 1 Samuel 17:26. David asked the men standing near him, "What will be done for the man who kills this Philistine and removes this disgrace from Israel? Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God?" I will continue with the next part to ensure the full adaptation. Stay tuned. David's perspective differed radically from that of the soldiers. While they saw an invincible giant, David saw merely an uncircumcised Philistine daring to defy the living God. This difference in perspective is key to understanding David's courage. His confidence was not rooted in his own strength or abilities, but in the faithfulness and power of God. When David offered to fight Goliath, he was met with skepticism and even ridicule. His own brother Eliab accused him of arrogance and irresponsibility. 1 Samuel 17:28. Even King Saul, who eventually agreed to let David face Goliath, tried to outfit him with his own armor, a gesture that, while well-intentioned, revealed a misunderstanding of the true source of David's strength. David's refusal to wear the armor, 1 Samuel 17:39, was not merely about physical comfort. It was a declaration of faith. He trusted not in human protection, but in divine assurance. David's words to Saul in 1 Samuel 17:37 capture this confidence. "The Lord who rescued me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will rescue me from the hand of this Philistine." Saul finally consented, telling David, "Go, and the Lord be with you." The confrontation between David and Goliath is one of the most dramatic and inspiring moments in biblical history. As David approached Goliath, his words continue to resonate through the ages. "You come against me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied." 1 Samuel 17:45. This declaration was more than a display of bravery. It was a profound profession of faith. David understood that this battle was not merely between him and Goliath. It was an opportunity for God to demonstrate his power to all nations. What followed was one of the most unexpected and decisive moments in Israel's history. Armed only with a sling and 5 smooth stones, David confronted the giant. 1 Samuel 17:49-50 describes the outcome. Reaching into his bag and taking out a stone, he slung it and struck the Philistine on the forehead. The stone sank into his forehead, and he fell face down on the ground. So David triumphed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone. Without a sword in his hand, he struck down the Philistine and killed him. This moment not only decided the battle, but dramatically illustrated that true strength lies not in physical might or weaponry, but in faith and trust in God. Goliath's fall with a single well-aimed stone was not just a lucky shot. It was a tangible manifestation of God's power, working through a faithful servant. David's victory over Goliath was not merely a personal triumph, but a turning point in Israel's history, marking the beginning of David's rise as a leader and future king. It served as a powerful testimony to God's ability to achieve the impossible through those who trust in him. The immediate impact of this victory is detailed in 1 Samuel 17:51-53. David ran and stood over him. He took hold of the Philistine's sword and drew it from the sheath. After he killed him, he cut off his head with the sword. When the Philistines saw that their hero was dead, they turned and ran. Then the men of Israel and Judah surged forward with a shout and pursued the Philistines to the entrance of Gath and to the gates of Ekron. Their dead were strewn along the Shaaraim road to Gath and Ekron. The defeat of Goliath did not merely eliminate an immediate threat, but also inspired the entire Israelite army to chase down and overcome the Philistines, turning what could have been a demoralizing defeat into a resounding victory. These two stories, separated by centuries, share deep themes that still resonate today. Both remind us that the giants in our lives, whether they are challenges, fears, or adversaries, can appear insurmountable at first. But when we trust in God and act in faith, we find that no obstacle is too great. The victories of Israel over Og and of David over Goliath were not the result of superior military strength or brilliant strategy. They came from an unshakable faith in the power and promises of God. This reminds us that in our own struggles, the key to victory does not lie in our strength or resources, but in our willingness to trust and obey God, even when circumstances seem impossible. Og and Goliath represent more than physical enemies. They symbolize all that intimidates us, causes us to doubt, and makes us afraid. They can be health problems, financial difficulties, troubled relationships, or inner battles. The principle, however, remains the same. With God, we can face and overcome even the most terrifying challenges. Just as the Israelites had to step into battle against Og, and David had to take the step of faith to face Goliath, we are called to act in faith when confronted by our own giants. God's promise in Isaiah 41:10 echoes through these stories and reaches out to us today. "Do not fear, for I am with you. Do not be dismayed, for I am your God. I will strengthen you and help you. I will uphold you with my righteous right hand." The story of Moses leading the Israelites against Og teaches us about the importance of faith-based leadership. Even when faced with an apparently unbeatable enemy, Moses trusted in God's promise and inspired the people to do the same. This reminds us that, as leaders in our own spheres of influence, our confidence in God can inspire others to confront their own giants. Moses' leadership in that critical moment was not based on his own strength or wisdom, but on his willingness to trust and obey God. Similarly, the story of David and Goliath shows that God often chooses the unlikely to fulfill his purposes. David was not a trained warrior, but a young shepherd. Yet his faith and courage made him the hero Israel needed at that moment. This encourages us not to underestimate our potential when aligned with God's purposes. As Paul writes in 1 Corinthians 1:27-29, "But God chose the foolish things of the world to shame the wise. God chose the weak things of the world to shame the strong. He chose the lowly things of this world and the despised things, and the things that are not, to nullify the things that are, so that no one may boast before him." This truth reminds us that God can use any of us, regardless of our apparent limitations, to achieve his purposes and bring glory to his name. Both stories also highlight the importance of relying on God's resources, not our own. The Israelites stood no chance against Og by relying solely on their strength, just as David could not have defeated Goliath with conventional weapons. It was their trust in God's power that made all the difference. This challenges us to reconsider how we approach our own challenges. Are we relying on our own abilities or on God's infinite strength? The Apostle Paul captured this truth in 2 Corinthians 12:9-10 when he wrote, "But he said to me, 'My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may rest on me. That is why, for Christ's sake, I delight in weaknesses, in insults, in hardships, in persecutions, in difficulties. For when I am weak, then I am strong.'" Finally, these narratives teach us about the nature of true courage. Courage is not the absence of fear, but the willingness to act despite it. Both Moses and David undoubtedly felt fear when facing their respective giants, yet they chose to act based on their faith, not their fears. This encourages us to face our own fears, knowing that God is with us, as we are reminded in Joshua 1:9, "Have I not commanded you? Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged, for the Lord your God will be with you wherever you go." These stories inspire us to cultivate courage rooted not in our own strength, but in the certainty of God's presence and power in our lives. They call us to take steps of faith, trusting that just as God was with Moses and David, he is also with us, ready to empower us to face any challenge that comes our way. As we reflect on these stories, it's clear that the victories over Og and Goliath carry a deeper message than just triumph in battle. They illustrate a shift in perspective, a way of seeing challenges through the lens of faith rather than fear. For the Israelites, facing Og meant confronting a giant not just in physical stature but in the symbolic weight of their own doubts and fears. They were no longer slaves, but their mindset had yet to fully embrace the freedom and identity that God was offering them. Similarly, David's confrontation with Goliath went beyond mere physical combat. It was a battle of perspectives, a young shepherd boy with a heart for God against a seasoned warrior with a hardened heart. Where others saw an unconquerable enemy, David saw an opportunity for God's glory to be revealed. This difference in perspective made all the difference, transforming David from an unnoticed shepherd into a hero whose courage inspired a nation. These stories challenge us to examine our own perspectives. How do we view the giants in our lives? Are we paralyzed by their size and strength, or do we see them as opportunities for God to demonstrate his power? The message is clear. Victory comes not from denying the challenges we face, but from seeing them through the eyes of faith. An often overlooked aspect of these stories is the preparation that preceded the battles. Moses, long before leading the Israelites against Og, had been prepared for his role through his years in the wilderness, learning patience and dependence on God. Likewise, David's preparation for his encounter with Goliath came during his time as a shepherd, where he faced predators like lions and bears. These experiences built his faith, teaching him to rely on God's strength rather than his own. This theme of preparation is a reminder that God often equips us for future challenges through present experiences. The hardships we endure and the smaller battles we face are not without purpose. They are training grounds, building our trust in God, and honing the skills we will need for the bigger battles ahead. For us, this means recognizing that our struggles today may be shaping us for a greater purpose tomorrow. When we face seemingly insurmountable obstacles, we can trust that God is not only with us in the moment, but has been preparing us for such challenges all along. Just as Moses' time in Midian and David's time in the fields were instrumental in their eventual victories, our own seasons of preparation are part of God's larger plan for our lives. Another crucial element in both stories is the balance between divine promises and human responsibility. When God promised the Israelites victory over Og, they still had to take up arms and engage in battle. Similarly, when David declared that God would deliver Goliath into his hands, he still had to step forward with his sling and face the giant. In both cases, God's promise required a response of faith-filled action. This interplay between God's sovereignty and human action is a central theme throughout the Bible. God often calls his people to act in faith, trusting that he will provide the strength and resources they need. The promise of victory does not mean that we can remain passive. Rather, it invites us into a partnership with God, where our actions are empowered by his presence. This balance is a powerful reminder for us today. While we trust in God's promises, we are also called to step out in faith, even when the path ahead seems uncertain. The Israelites could not have conquered Bashan without God's help, but they also had to march forward into battle. David could not have defeated Goliath without divine intervention, but he still needed to take the first step onto the battlefield. Our own challenges require the same blend of faith and action, trusting that God will meet us as we step forward in obedience. The outcomes of these biblical battles did not end with the victories themselves. Their impact rippled outward, influencing the course of history. The defeat of Og not only secured territory for the Israelites, but also instilled a newfound confidence in God's promises. It became a story that future generations would remember and draw strength from, a testament to God's faithfulness that was recounted in worship and teaching. David's victory over Goliath, too, had far-reaching effects. It marked the beginning of a shift in Israel's fortunes, paving the way for David's rise to prominence and eventually his kingship. More than that, it served as a symbol of hope for the people, a reminder that God's power was not limited by human expectations or appearances. David's courage became a standard of faith, inspiring countless others to trust in God's power over their own. These ripple effects remind us that our acts of faith, no matter how small they may seem, can have a lasting impact beyond what we can see. When we trust God in our challenges, we not only experience his faithfulness in our own lives, but also inspire others around us. Our victories in faith become stories of hope and encouragement for those who come after us, echoing through time just as the stories of Og and Goliath have done. While Og and Goliath were literal giants, their stories speak to the metaphorical giants we all face in our own lives: fear, doubt, insecurity, and pride. These internal struggles can be just as daunting as any physical enemy. The Israelites' fear of Og and the army's terror of Goliath reflect our own tendencies to be overwhelmed by the challenges that loom large in our minds. David's example, however, shows us that the first step in overcoming these giants is to confront them directly with faith. Instead of allowing fear to dictate his actions, David chose to focus on God's strength. His story encourages us to face our own fears, trusting that God is bigger than any challenge we might encounter. It's a reminder that courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. When we face our internal giants, we are not alone. God is with us, offering his strength and guidance. Just as he guided David's hand with the sling, he can guide us through our struggles, providing the wisdom and strength we need. The legacy of these stories is one of trusting God beyond human understanding. Moses trusted God to lead the Israelites to victory against a king who seemed invincible. David trusted God to give him victory over a warrior who had terrified an entire army. Both stories show that the most important battles are won not with physical strength, but with a heart that is willing to trust God's promises, even when they defy human logic. This legacy is meant to inspire us today. In a world where challenges can seem overwhelming, we are called to place our trust in a God who has already demonstrated his power to overcome the impossible. When we choose to trust God in the face of uncertainty, we become part of a story much larger than ourselves. A story that has been unfolding since the time of Moses and David and continues through each of us. As we reflect on the stories of Og and Goliath, we are left with a powerful invitation. It is an invitation to trust God with the giants in our own lives, to step out in faith even when the outcome is uncertain, and to believe that God's strength is made perfect in our weakness. These stories teach us that victory is not about having the best resources or the most strength, but about trusting in the one who holds all power. So when faced with challenges that seem too great to overcome, remember the stories of Og and Goliath. Remember that God is not looking for the strongest or the most capable. He is looking for those who are willing to believe in his promises and act in faith. Like Moses and David, we are invited to trust that God can use even our smallest acts of faith to accomplish great things. As you face your own giants, take courage from these ancient stories. Step forward with the same faith that led David to pick up his sling and face Goliath, and the same trust that led Moses to confront the powerful King Og. And know that just as God was with them, He is with you, ready to fight on your behalf and bring about victories that go beyond your own strength. In the end, these stories are not just about ancient battles. They are about the timeless truth that with God all things are possible. They challenge us to trust God's power, to act in faith, and to believe that no matter how great our challenges may seem, God's power is greater still. And as we embrace